Good afternoon and welcome. I'm your host, Rosalind Layton with China Tech Threat. Today's quick cut event, countdown to new export controls, which spell trouble for YMTC and the implications for Apple. I'm pleased to be with you for this lunchtime discussion. We have two excellent experts on this topic. We're going to break it down for you, what's going on at the Bureau of Industry and Security at Department of Commerce and what to expect going forward. Today, I'm pleased to have Nazak Nakakhtar. She is the partner and national security co-chair of Wiley-Rein, and formerly she was with Department of Commerce, being the lead for CPIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Our other expert is Dustin Carmack, research fellow with the Heritage Foundation. Earlier, Dustin served in various positions as a congressional staffer and with the Office of National Intelligence. So today's event is live streamed. And if you have a question, please reach out to us at info@chinatechthreat.com. We encourage you to tweet the event, share your thoughts on Twitter, and you can message us at China Tech Threat. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off with our excellent speakers. So, the election was a week ago, but it looks like many things are still running. We don't know all of the outcome. It looks like the House will go to Republicans, however narrowly. And we can see that Representative Michael McCaul of Texas has made a lot of discussion about export controls at Bureau of Industry and Security. And he may well be the next chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So, and he's had a number of statements and events where he's talked about export controls and what we need to do. And he's pledged to be focused like a laser on these issues. So for both of our panelists today, how is McCaul going to do this? How is he going to bring attention to export control issues? What do you think? So Dustin, do you want to start us off? Go ahead.
I'll start. My understanding, future Chairman McCaul, I believe it's safe to say now at this point, I think he has really outlined, again, he's been beating this drum now for a few years. But my understanding too is that they're going to launch, once the committee's formed and getting going, a solid 90-day review of BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security over at Commerce. And they're going to be trying to unpack everything from the current personnel and capabilities that they have in that office, expertise that's needed, not only to look at, the issues as it relates to China, but, think about all the other variety of players around the globe in the national security space, if it's Iran or Russia or North Korea or others. So this is going to be, a comprehensive review, and also even looking, I think, at the structure of where BIS is currently located. I think, moving different around parts of the bureaucracy, a lot of people like to kind of slap, a new tag to, DOD or something like that. I worry about, doing such a move, and again, it's even, likelihood I think would be very difficult. But at the same time, I do think this review by McCaul will give a solid ground. I mean, my understanding is before the current BIS undersecretary spoke at the committee here recently, the BIS secretary hadn't been there in over 10 years. So, I mean, this kind of shows you that this is kind of an area, other than the CFIUS reforms and some of the things that have been done here in recent years around the edges, we haven't really taken a good look at the challenge that China brings and then what needs to be brought to bear. So I think, McCaul is going to, take a real keen focus at this.
Mm-hmm. So, well, let me follow up with that with you, Nazak. I mean, you have been in this on both sides of this yourself. And Congress has for a long time got frustrated, at saying BIS, you need to do these things and so forth, waiting for lists and so on hasn't happened. What are your thoughts? Do you think a new Congress can change this, or will we get more of the same?
Yeah, look, I think the trend is 100% heading in that direction. As Dustin said, I want to give a little sort of a background of why and how Chairman McCaul has really sort of come into this. And really every place that he's looked and every lid he's sort of taken on, he's like, oh my gosh, there's a problem, and rightfully so. And I commend him, I commend his group and Congress for taking time and effort to learn into this. But, Chairman McCaul, looked at, so when we originally put Huawei on the entity list, the license review policy was a presumption of denial. Okay. And then moved to a case-by-case license review policy. McCall asked for licensing statistics for U.S. exports to Huawei and says, oh my gosh, why are all these things being approved, the licenses being approved to Huawei when Huawei's on the entity list, when it normally should have a license review criteria presumption of denial? Every other place Chairman McCall has looked at, others in Congress have looked at, said, look, there's gaps in the system. Why isn't anybody filling the gaps? So I think what Congress, and specifically also Chairman McCall, is going to do is really to look at the licensing policies, really do a thorough review of the regulations, and figure out if there's licenses that are approved, why is it, but also instances are licenses not required, and why aren't licenses required, and what are the loopholes in the rules, if any, or just gaps that we need to fix. So I think they're going to be aggressive on that. I think they're going to take more effort to understand how the system works to better detect these types of issues, and also determine, what needs to be done next. Where do the authorities need to go? As Dustin says, do they need to go elsewhere? Are they adequate at commerce? I think time will tell, but make no mistake, this is going to be a whole scale review of everything that BIS does to figure out where every single problem is and what measures are required to fix those problems.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that background. It's really helpful. So, let's turn to another story in the news. New York Times has done a piece about Apple, front page story that was talking about its supply chain and specifically its relationship with the military-aligned chip fab YMTC, which is Yangtze Memory Technologies Corporation. And, I want to say, Dustin, you and I have talked about YMTC most recently in Miami at an event with the Lincoln Network. It was important discussion about reindustrialization in the United States and, American companies' roles with Chinese government and Chinese government aligned companies. So I'm curious, do you think that we'll hear Apple, pledging not to use YMTC chips in the iPhone? As I understand already, some of these chips have been shipped to iPhones in China. Certainly concerned that these chips would be ending up in the U.S., facilitating greater government surveillance of Americans via the iPhone.
Yeah, honestly, it's wild to me that we're still, chatting about this, that Apple has not, it surprised me in the first place that they were engaging in these discussions. And part of me was wondering if it was just a negotiating tactic, trying to kind of nickel and dime other semiconductor companies that are in this space and memory and try to lower their cost. They try to kind of then placate people by saying, oh, we're only going to use these chips for our Chinese sales. But at the end of the day, the whole idea here is, this is a company that, is essentially a state-backed, company, as many of our Chinese companies are. And they are, essentially going to be used as, a mechanism just like solar panels and everything else to try to undercut the broader global memory chip sector. And so, how, Apple is engaging in this, I think, at the end of the day, commerce may take care of that for them, especially when they get done with the 60-day review, which I think the likelihood of China allowing any kind of in-use inspectors in China to look at these chips is very unlikely. And so the likelihood of them being on the entity list, I think, is quite high by early December. But again, it's going to really, keep the fire on the administration to make sure they actually get through with this. And again, Apple's kind of been a shiny, object and success for, an American company, but they've essentially, between having, roughly 3 million, workers in their manufacturing sector kind of spread out, and, now considering also using, more Chinese based elements, including which I think about 25% of the iPhone raw cost are related to the memory chips. And so I just think, Apple, you probably should see the writing on the wall, but I think they also are being very careful not to anger, the CCP now, especially that Chairman Xi has received another term. And I think there's going to be a close eye, especially with the additional export controls and possible reaction to those. I think there's everybody in the manufacturing space is trying to keep a close eye on what Xi's reaction could be to those.
Yeah. So that's thank you for sharing that. It's very helpful. What I would like to encourage our audience is to make sure that they check out your materials there at Heritage Foundation. You have written about this extensively. China Tech Threat has as well. We have a report called Silicon Sellout where we talk about what Apple's relationship in China. The author of this New York Times story, Trip Mickle, he has a book about, it's titled How Apple Lost Its Soul. And he has been doing this long-term reporting around supply chains. And, basically the prowess of Apple and Tim Cook has been to essentially leverage everything in China at all levels to deliver its products. It's become very profitable in the process. But the sort of security is kind of an afterthought, as we've seen. So it's definitely very much on people's minds. Talking a little bit more about YMTC and BIS, let me turn to you, Nazak, because the news of today from Reuters, we have Matthew Axelrod, who is an official over at BIS. He said he's talking about this unverified list, that there's a set of Chinese government-aligned companies that BIS has been looking at, and there's been an attempt at BIS to sort of check them out and see, they're legitimate threats, in addition to many other things they do. So there's some indication that YMTC would be moved onto the entity list as early as December 6th. He said, if we're unable to complete an end-use check by then. So I'm curious, maybe would you talk to us a little bit about these two lists and this process, about how this works? And do you think we're going to see YMTC added to the entity list?
Yeah, I mean, just for the audience's benefit, these end-use checks enable the U.S. government to go and see, look, if a license has been granted, is a foreign entity adhering to the terms and conditions under which licenses were granted, and also items that didn't require licenses. Are they really truly the types of items that didn't require a license, or are they, required? And I say this to really underscore the fact that the quality of what you're able to see and probe is very immaterial. Rosalind, I want to kind of give you sort of an anecdotal story. When 20 years ago, I was a U.S. government auditor for a separate group at the Commerce Department called Enforcement and Compliance. I used to audit for Chinese companies' operations for the U.S. government. MOFCOM, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, both authorized our checks and BIS's end-use checks. When we checked, we had, even to this day, we had unrestricted access to the Chinese multinationals' facilities, email addresses, everything, to make sure that there weren't hidden costs or hidden sales. MOFCOM, on the other hand, for BIS, the same bureau within the same exact agency, the U.S. Commerce Department, says, no, you can only have half a day. And we'll tell you when you can, and we're going to drag this out so we have time to cook the books and records and all of that. That is astounding. That all should underscore the fact that today our end-use checks are severely constrained by MOFCOM in a way that they don't constrain the other group at the Commerce Department. So I think Matt Axelrod is absolutely correct. His approach is sound. If we can't conduct adequate end-use checks, we move you to the entity list. However, the problem here is that, one, we don't have very many resources in China to conduct all the end-use checks that are required. If you compare the number of licenses that are authorized versus things that don't require licenses to China, but we may not want them to be used in particular end uses, compared to just less than a handful of people in China for end use checks, there's a mismatch. There's a problem I just discussed too about quality, which brings me to the final point. It's great if we can get in. It's great if China authorizes end-use checks, but are they going to constrain our ability to go in there and do the thorough, top-down, right and left, the full comprehensive check that we need to make sure that the terms and conditions of the license are adhered to? And are we going to be satisfied when we walk away from the end-use checks to make sure that none of the books and materials that we reviewed are doctored? I think the result of that is very likely to be no. And I think you're going to find more and more companies going to the unverified list and then making it to the entity list. which, as the audience knows, the entity list is the U.S. government's blacklist, essentially, which restricts exports to those foreign entity listed companies absent a license from the Commerce Department.
Great. Well, there's a lot going on there. Dustin, is there anything that you want to add to that discussion, in terms of, your experience from the Hill and then from in national intelligence of how would that set up any red flags for you if you were trying to do a check on an entity and were unable to get through? I mean, what would that say from intelligence perspective?
Yeah, I'm just extremely skeptical about the Chinese, and even if you do have the personnel to be able to do it, getting a solid check on and being satisfactory in terms of feeling good about that license. But my issue is, and I think where the Hill needs to take a keen focus on this is deep oversight. Again, I think it will be helpful to have McCall, regardless of even the party in control, there should be a better oversight of what's going on over at Commerce and BIS in this space. I think there's definitely interest on both sides of the aisle of tackling this, but the problem is there's a swirl around Washington of the cash flow that, people are relying on from China and Chinese business here. They're trying to kind of water these types of things down. We saw it play out in the CHIPS Act debate when they were trying to water down any kind of further restrictions or operations of American, semiconductor companies still wanting to do significant amounts of business in China. So this is, something that, it's there's going to be pain points, but, Congress needs to take a really close eye here. And I think, guys like Senator Rubio and others have tried to really call this out, that we cannot, look like we're doing, a lot of good things with press releases and splashy interviews without really doing the backbone work to make sure this is done properly or things are actually blocked.
Rosalind, I want to add to that. With the other group of the Commerce Department, when we did the audits, we wrote reports. We wrote extensive reports. We collected records of evidence. Those were protected under Administrative Protective Order of the Commerce Department, and only parties in litigation could see it. But the point is this: there's no reason why BIS can't write extensive reports about what they looked at, what they didn't look at, take copies of records that they checked, and make sure that Congress has access to that, to make sure that Congress, with their expertise, or the other federal agencies, can look at that and inform Commerce's process even better, and then also, of course, provide better oversight as to what exactly Commerce is doing. You can't have an agency always operate in a black box. There's got to be ability to check, to review, to improve by looking and review, and of course, again, oversight.
So I'm going to ask to both of you. I mean, when we talk, as you've just revealed, with one of the most important sectors of our information economy, semiconductors, we have a tremendous attack surface, if you will. And a lot of this, in addition to, our defenses, our armed forces, we're relying on regulatory agencies to deliver security for us as American people. And as you've both indicated, the quality of the checks is really going to vary. So it's one thing to make the law, it's another to make sure, does the agency enforce the law? And then when they even attempt to do the administration and the enforcement, what can they actually do, even to the best of their own abilities? So really, there's a whole chain here of things that have to happen to keep Americans safe. So, and that's just one small area where we talk about, I think there's something on the order of all of the, let's say, strategic technologies or sensitive technologies, well less than 1% are even controlled. So we have huge amounts of dual use technologies which are not controlled, and we're just zeroing in on the few that would, and we could argue there's many more. So just to bring in another agency here, Federal Communications Commission, they have a huge responsibility with the covered list. If you might know that last Friday, the 11th, it was the 1-year anniversary of the Secure Equipment Act, which had required the FCC to make an announcement about these covered list entities. And this has to do with the authorization for equipment to use radio spectrum. So anything, when you all look at your Wi-Fi router at home, there'll be a little FCC sticker on it. And so now the issue has been these surveillance cameras, high vision surveillance cameras. And so now the question, of course, is the FCC has been tasked to prepare rules, and there are major exemptions of the rules which still allow that equipment to be available to consumers. I'm curious if either of you want to weigh in on what does that mean for security. Again, here we have another situation, not unlike BIS, where Congress is asking, and asking Federal Communications Commission, please enforce these rules to protect Americans.
Yeah, I mean, I could start there. Look, what the FCC doing is 100% steps in the right direction. But again, I want to underscore, there is a mismatch. We are playing a whack-a-mole game. We have been playing a whack-a-mole game. And what we're doing right now is not consistent with the size, scale, and scope of the problem and the size, scale, and scope of the Chinese problem specifically. The Chinese presence in terms of the communications, information communications, technology and services, supply chain in the United States is extensive. And if we think that these small steps, important steps, but small steps really solve the national security problem, is not the way. Remember, China is a civil military fusion strategy country where one company goes down, the CCP authorizes or mandates another company to prop up, or they kind of organically do it. All of the information flows back to the CCP. We know this is a national security threat. I also wanted to mention that we have the Information Communications Technology and Services Executive Order that President Trump signed in 2019. President Biden has embraced. Secretary Raimondo of Commerce has issued at least 4 subpoenas last spring of 2021, investigating companies. Hello, what are we waiting for? We know the threats are there. We have the legal, and this is one of those instances where we actually have the legal tools and we're not just doing enough. And I think most fundamentally, if the FCC process is narrow and is going to be continue to play a whack-a-mole game, maybe they can continue to do what they need to do, but we really need to supplement that with the ICTS executive order authority that everybody's just kind of sitting on, waiting for somebody else to move on. We've got to move now.
Mm-hmm. Tell me again, ICTS, I'm forgetting the acronym.
Yeah, the Information Communications Technologies and Services executive order that pretty much authorizes the administration to prohibit any transactions in the ICTS, which is the Information Communications Technology and Services supply chain, allows the administration to prohibit any significant transactions in the United States if they're of the kind of magnitude that impact national security. The telecommunications issues, Rosalind, that you're posing in your questions are exactly the type that FCC needs to tackle, and the administration and the Commerce Department needs to tackle. Is the right hand not talking to the left hand? Why are they not being coordinated? And why have we not used, it's 2022, the executive order came out in 2019. Why have we still not used it when the threats are here and the threats are growing?
It's a great point. For our audience, if you go to China Tech Threat's website, you can see our filings to the FCC about the covered list. And we make the point that there's 10 entities on the covered list, including Huawei and ZTE, subject to many other government controls. And if we were serious about the covered list, there might be hundreds, if not thousands of entities on it. I mean, if you actually take seriously what it's supposed to do. And so just as an example, even though Huawei was on the entity list in 2018, in this ensuing 3 years, some 3,000 approvals were granted to Huawei for other kinds of equipment to be sold in the US economy. So it's just a great example of how, just because you set up an entity or you set up a kind of list or you set up some sort of regulation, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily getting the adequate or complete security that you think you are. I mean, all of these instruments are very narrowly tailored because we are a rule of law country, and we don't really have the instruments designed to make full blockades of technology other than, as you're describing, the ICTS executive order. And so that's not yet a step that administration has yet taken. Question to you, Dustin. We've talked here about BIS, we've talked about FCC. What other tools are in the toolbox here for the administration and Congress to get on top of this issue? I think a threat, maybe you can characterize for us how, we are in a state of threats. Certainly, there's a war raging with Ukraine. There's a lot of concerns about Taiwan. So what other things are there for policymakers to keep America safe?
Yeah, there's a few items. First off, real quickly on the telecommunication side too. One of the things that was telling last year in the CHIPS Act debate was there were some amendments. I think that Senator Rubio had offered to actually fund the remaining $3 billion of rip and replace of Chinese telecom equipment that's currently in the country and operating primarily out kind of the Midwest and the Western states. But I mean, that's something that again, should have been funded at that point in time. We should be getting this done. This was told to be, got out. We were working with our allies and partners in the UK and others who also had to even go through more extensive efforts on some of these kind of rip and replace efforts. So that's one. Two, I think there's a ton to do at the state level. I mean, I think that states, offer some opportunities here, especially in the technology space, to be proactive where Congress may not be. And so, my old boss, Governor DeSantis, he just offered a really great executive order and is planning on doing a variety of legislation this upcoming session in Florida, really targeted, primarily those who want to do contracting business with the state or current state entities and removing different Chinese equipment, but also giving some flexibility for those standards to be implemented in a way that, either, an adversary can't get around in some ways, but also, allow some flexibility at the local level. Because we also see, in other spaces too. I mean, look at what like TikTok or like companies like DJI have done too at the state level to try to water down restrictions in this space or fight back against any kind of federal restrictions. So, we even have issues with removing Chinese kind of electronic equipment, even through NDAA, like Section 8889. There's, kind of waiver authorities that I think Congress needs to take a keen eye that makes sure that these agencies that are receiving waiver authority are actually building out a battle plan to do the underlying intent of Congress in those. So that's another area. And then, one thing, I think too, is that our international partners are really important here. So, a lot of these rules that are kind of be, coming down the pike now, including some of the great, stuff that's coming out of commerce, will only be functional if we are working with Japan and the Netherlands on blocking some of this equipment on semiconductors from getting to, TSMC or not TSMC, YMTC, and some of the others in China. That will be key because, a lot of the best technology too, they'll just, like I said, the Chinese will look to supplement suppliers from other places. They'll either try to do it through their home manufacturing or separately go through those. And so unless we have Japan and South Korea and the Netherlands with us on this, it will be kind of a fruitless effort. And so I know that there's good inroads there. They're trying to get this done, but they're not quite across that finish line yet. And then, back to, the original question on the manufacturing space. I mean, you can't reinvent 3 million workers overnight, especially for some of these types of jobs. So when we're looking at things like the Development Finance Corporation, which was essentially a reform of OPIC and some of these things that were the State Department to focus literally on China, I don't think DFC is doing enough to focus on that. I think they're funding a lot of efforts that aren't really geared towards these big problems, and we could be using those types of authorities more fundamentally in the executive branch to cut deals with countries that can help build a better firewall against kind of some of these Chinese adverse intents and some of the Belt and Road Initiative efforts. So there's a lot of room to grow there, I think, as well.
I'm glad you bring up go ahead, Nazar, please.
I was also going to say, let me just mention IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That also gives the administration broad and sweeping authorities to deal with the modern threats. And I am appalled that we're not using that authority as aggressively enough. Again, if you compare it to the current threats that our country is facing right now, and the fact that we are currently under siege with all of the surveillance equipment and destabilizing equipment in the United States, I'm again stunned that we're not using the tools on the tool chest, and we have some pretty exquisite tools. And then if we're not using it, I think the fundamental question is why? Why are we so reluctant to use them?
It's a great point. And I would like to suggest those who want to know more, it's interesting how Dustin brought up the role of Florida Governor DeSantis. We can also look at Georgia's Governor Kemp. These are two states who have moved on state level cybersecurity, where they are refusing any state enterprise within the state government will not purchase any products or services from Chinese government firms, will not do any contracting with them. So whereas it might seem like we're pulling teeth with the federal agency to do their federally mandated responsibilities, lots of state governors are stepping up, and we at China Tech Threat, we have a mapping of the U.S. where each state is on this issue. Heritage Foundation has also done some excellent work looking at what is going on at the state level. Again, that's great, but that doesn't solve all of the issues. We are a nation with many people, lots of opportunities for vulnerability and attack. So in any case, I want to thank our speakers today, Nazak Nakakhtar, Wiley Ryan, and Dustin Carmack of the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for contributing your wisdom and knowledge with us on this quick cut event. Thank you also for the audience, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Roslyn.